Welcome, and in this segment we'll explore the diversification of early Hanafi theology, beginning with al-Ḥakīm al-Samarqandī's Kitāb al-Sawād al-Azam, defining texts of early mainstream Hanafism in Transoxania. And we then examine how parallel movements such as Najjāriyya and Karrāmiyya challenged and enriched this tradition and compelled the scholars in Khurasan and Samarkand to refine their arguments. And finally, we'll see how these developments culminated in the towering figure of Abū Manṣūr al-Maturidi, whose works like Kitāb al-Tawḥīd and Taʻwīlāt al-Qur'ān crystallized a balanced approach between intellect, or the al-Aql, and revelation, or naql, and it established a theological school that bears his name to this day. When al-Ḥakīm al-Samarqandī compiled his great Kitāb al-Sawād al-Aʿẓam, the Hanafi theological tradition was no longer entirely unified, and by that time it was already showing the signs of diversification, with various interpretations and doctrinal strands beginning to develop. This is, however, doesn't render the Kitāb al-Sawād outdated or irrelevant, but on the contrary, it provides a reliable account of mainstream Hanafism, especially as it was understood in northeastern Iran, or the Khurasan and Transoxania, or the Mawara al-Nahr. Yet at the peripheries of this mainstream tradition, new theological tendencies were emerging. And over time, these currents influenced the broader Hanafi discourses and laid the groundwork for reinterpretations and systematic elaboration, most notably by Abū Manṣūr al-Maturidi. When significant development occurred in Western Iran, particularly in Ray, with the rise of Hanafi Kalami school under Abu Abdullah al-Husayn and Najjar, and he along with his student, most notably al-Barghuth, crafted a sophisticated theological approach that blended traditional Hanafi convictions with doctrines borrowed from Mu'tazila, and particularly the teaching of Dirar ibn Amr. And this movement, later referred to as the Najjāriyya, was largely independent of the early Eastern Ḥanafīs, who remained closer to the original positions of Imam Abu Hanifa and were less engaged in the speculative theology, or al-Kalam. Over time, however, as Kalam became increasingly central to Transoxanian Hanafism, the teaching of Najjāriyya couldn't be ignored. Their influence compelled the Eastern scholars to address the questions raised by these Western developments, enriching the intellectual landscape and preparing the way for al-Maturidi's later systematization. Another significant development in this period was the rise of Karrāmites, or al-Karrāmiyya, a movement based on the teaching of Ibn Karam from Sistan. They introduced a distinctive model of the religious insight and practical piety, or the ibadah, that attracted many believers in the Eastern Iran, or the Khurasan. While some of their ideas were influenced by Sufism in matter of theology and law, or the fiqh, they remained largely rooted in Hanafism. The emergence of the Karrāmites challenged the traditional Hanafi scholars, and it prompted them to refine their doctrines and strengthen their arguments to defend the integrity of their theological heritage. At the same time, the internal development of Hanafism in Khurasan and Transoxania shows signs of early diversification, perhaps earlier than the modern research often assumes. Unfortunately, we lack surviving theological works from 9th century Eastern Hanafis. But what we know comes mostly from the later biographical sources, which indicates that some scholars like Abu Nasr al-Iyadi, a teacher of al-Maturidi, were engaged in the theological discourses, or the Kalam, and may have written treatises on the subject. A recent manuscript discovered in Istanbul, or the manuscript of Shahid Ali Pasha, provides further insight. This manuscript contains a commentary on Abu Salama al-Samarqandī's Jamal Usūl-ud-Din, and it reveals how the two distinct Hanafi strands coexisted in 9th century Samarkand. Number one, a Kalam-oriented strand, and it represented by scholars such as Abu Sulaiman al-Jurjani and Abu Nasr al-Iyadi, teaching in a school referred to as Dar al-Jurjaniyya. Number two, a traditionalist strand, skeptical of Kalam, represented by authors such as Abu Bakr and Abu Ahmad al-Iyadi, are the sons of Abu Nasr and al-Ḥakīm al-Samarqandī. And this distinction is remarkable, and it suggests that even within early Hanafism in Transoxania, there was a dynamic tension between the rational theology and traditionalism, a tension that will later shape the development of Maturidism. And this historical insight opens new avenues for research into the evolution of the early Hanafi thought, and shows that the theological pluralism and intellectual engagement were present long before the formal rise of Maturidi. And beyond the internal developments within Hanafism, an important external factor also shaped its trajectory in northeastern Iran. The arrival, or more precisely the return, of the renowned Mu'tazili scholar Abul Qasim al-Ka'bi. Although this event was not directly part of the Hanafi history, its influence on Transoxanian Hanafism was significant. Al-Ka'bi, originally from Balkh, studied theology under al-Khayyat, who introduced him to the rationalist doctrines of Mu'tazili school of Baghdad. And returning to Iran, he served as the secretary first in Tabaristan and later in Balkh, and ultimately becoming a celebrated theologian and teacher. And his prominence is even acknowledged by al-Maturidi when his Kitāb al-Tawḥīd ironically referred to the Ka'bi as the Imam of all people of the world. And unsurprisingly, al-Maturidi's writings frequently engage with the al-Ka'bi's teaching and often presenting subtle yet thorough defense of the Hanafi theological thought. Unlike his rival, al-Maturidi appears to have lived his entire life in Samarkand and possibly born around 870 and passing away there in 944. And later historians provide scant information on his personal life, suggesting a conventional scholarly existence. What is well documented, however, is the breadth of al-Maturidi's intellectual output. He authored works covering theology, ilm al-kalam, Quranic exegesis, polemics against the Mu'tazilites and Imamites, doxography or heresiography like Kitāb al-Maqālāt, jurisprudence, and the art of disputation or al-Jadal. A notable example may include Bayan Wahm al-Mu'tazila, clarifying Mu'tazila's errors or misconceptions, Radd Usul al-Khamsa, or the refutation of the 5 foundational points, رد أوائل الأدلة للكعبي, respond to al-Ka'bi's initial arguments, رد كتاب الكعبي في وعيد الفساق, refutation and promises and punishment for sinner, and رد كتاب الإعمامة لبعض الروافد, كتاب الجدل, and رد تهذيب الجدل للكعبي, the art of disputation. These works reveal that Maturidi was not merely a traditionalist religious scholar, but a trained academic proficient in higher theological disciplines. While many of his writings are unfortunately lost, but 2 survives as his masterpieces. Number 1, Taʻwīlāt al-Qur'ān, are also called Taʻwīlāt al-Sunnah, an extensive Quranic commentary. Number 2, Kitāb al-Tawḥīd, a foundational text on Hanafi kalam and doctrinal theology. Through these works, al-Maturidi established the intellectual foundation of Maturidism, or the al-Maturidiyya, combining the rational inquiry with faithful adherence to Qur'an and Sunnah, and shaping the Hanafi theological tradition for centuries to come. The Taʻwīlāt al-Qur'ān survives in more than 30 manuscripts, and suggests that it was widely read and highly valued by later scholars, particularly during the Ottoman period. And in contrast, the Kitāb al-Tawḥīd is preserved in a single manuscript which is both incomplete and littered with errors. And despite these challenges, it has been edited twice, first in 1970 by Khulaif and again in 2003 by Topologlu and Naruchi. And as a result, it has been received considerable scholarly attention and has been examined in numerous articles and monographs. And according to these studies, the Kitāb al-Tawḥīd can be regarded as a true theological summa or al-Jami' al-Kalami. Its structure differs significantly from the early Hanafi writings. It follows the Kalam methodology developed by Mu'tazilites in the early 9th century. And a notable feature of al-Maturidi's Tawḥīd is the extensive engagement with the theological opponents, setting it apart from the early Hanafi works, including Kitāb al-Sawād al-Azam of al-Ḥakīm al-Samarqandī, which, although titled al-Radd ala ashab al-Ahwā, the refutation of the sectarians, it doesn't engage in the detailed disputations. However, al-Maturidi addresses a wide range of opponents, including non-Islamic religions and worldviews such as Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Mecanians, Marcionites, Sabians, and even the Hellenistic philosophical legacy summarized under the term of Dahiriyya. His primary focus, however, is on Muslim thinkers with differing views, including Abul Qasim al-Ka'bi, Muhammad ibn al-Shabib, Abu Abdullah al-Najjār, and the Smiley thinker, Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Nasafi. Through this comprehensive engagement, al-Maturidi not only defends Hanafi theological principles, but also situates them in a dialogue with the broader intellectual and religious current of his time. And before engaging with his opponents, al-Maturidi begins by outlining the foundation of his epistemology. And following the standard methods of the early Kalam, he identifies 3 primary means of acquiring knowledge. Number 1, sense perception, or al-Ihsās, revelation and transmitted reports, or al-Akhbār, and the rational speculation, or intellect. In the opening section of al-Tawḥīd, a distinctive Hanafi emphasis emerges. The importance of the rational speculation is highlighted far more strongly than was typically among Sunni scholars of his period. And according to al-Maturidi, human beings are capable of knowing God's existence and discerning good from evil even without revelation, relying solely on intellect or al-Aql. And this position echoes the teaching of Imam Abu Hanifa and contrasts sharply with that of al-Ash'ari, for whom reason alone was insufficient for moral and theological knowledge. And second major topic addressed in Kitāb al-Tawḥīd is the metaphysical structure of the created world. Al-Maturidi's treatment of this issue is brief and somewhat opaque. Notably, he rejects the atomism, a theory widely accepted by many of his contemporaries. Instead, he argues that every corporeal being is composed of nature, or the tabai', likely the 4 classical qualities: heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. These qualities naturally repel each other, and it is only God's unifying act that binds them into coherent bodies. And in addition to natures, al-Maturidi posits the existence of the accident, which appear to account for the changing attributes of the body, such as motion, rest, color, and other perceptible qualities. However, his discussion in the Tawhid is not fully detailed, leaving significant gaps in understanding his physical theory. However, further study, particularly of the recently edited Taʻwīlāt, is necessary to gain a more complete picture of his cosmology and metaphysics. And in contrast to his relatively brief treatment of the physical world, al-Maturidi's reflection on God and the divine attributes of the Sifatullah are extremely detailed and systematically organized. This section forms by far the largest portion of Tawhid, and it combines his own positions and arguments with the extensive refutation of both Muslim rivals and non-Muslims. And according to al-Maturidi, God's most essential attributes include oneness, the Tawhid, absolute transcendence, al-Tanzih, freedom of choice, al-Ikhtiyar, power, will, al-Irada, knowledge, al-Ilm, creation or existentiation, or the Takween. And the last attributes, the Takween, is particularly significant in Ḥanafī and Maturidi theology. Beyond these fundamentals, the Kitāb al-Tawḥīd also includes a concise and profound discussion on God's wisdom or the hikmah, revealing the originality of al-Maturidi's theological framework. His position differs fundamentally from both Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites. And according to al-Maturidi, God possesses absolute power and freedom to create as He wills and to set or the wada everything according to His rules. And this includes the freedom to define what is bad and what is good, and which is not objective norms but divinely established. And at the same time, God is perfectly wise and just, so His actions are never arbitrary. Consequently, the created world embodies the perfect order, and its ontological structure and moral norms can be apprehended through rational understanding. And this systematic integration of reason and revelation marks a defining feature of Ḥanafī Maturidi theology. God's wisdom or al-Hikmah continues to be a central theme when al-Maturidi discusses the prophethood in the Tawhid. And according to him, the prophets or al-Anbiya were not only the bearers of the religion, but also the agent of the cultural and societal advancement. This perspective had previously been articulated by the late 9th century Mu'tazili descent Ibn Rawandi, and al-Maturidi notably doesn't hesitate to cite him in this context. The remaining section of the Tawhid covers human action and their relation to God's all-encompassing activity, or the af'āl al-insāni wa ta'thīr Allah, which is sin and divine punishment, al-dhunūb wal-'iqāb, the belief and faith, the al-Iman. Although these topics had already been extensively discussed in earlier Hanafi texts, al-Maturidi presents them in a new and refined form, occasionally modifying the traditional doctrines with original conceptual innovations. And this is especially evident in his discussion of human action, which introduced subtle distinctions in human capacities. Number one, permanent capacity, or istita'atul asbab wal ahwal, the inherent ability endowed by human physical constitution. Number two, momentary actual capacity, istita'atul fi'l, the immediate realized ability to act in a given situation. These distinctions allow for a more nuanced understanding of free will, al-ikhtiyar, and human responsibility, highlighting al-Maturidi's careful integration of reason and revelation in Hanafi theology. As we close today's discussion, we are reminded that the formation of the Maturidi theology wasn't an isolated event. It was the fruit of the centuries of debate, dialogue, and devotion among the scholars who sought to understand the divine through both reason and faith. In the next episode, we'll go deeper into al-Maturidi's epistemology, exploring how he defined the sources of knowledge, sense perception, transmission, and rational speculation, and how these become the cornerstone of Maturidism to emerge in a full-fledged way.